So rather than divide our discussion of hands into basic and intermediate or basic and advanced or anything like that, we're going to separate based on the techniques we're going to be looking at. And the two kind of big broad techniques for rigging hands we're going to call mechanical and replacement. So let's start by looking at mechanical hands. I refer to these as mechanical hand rigs because they basically approach rigging the fingers as if they were limbs like arms or legs. So you're manually positioning the fingers in order to create poses. And essentially all of the same basic techniques that we use to rig arms and legs can be used to rig fingers and thumbs, creating all kinds of different possible mechanical hand rigs. We, of course, were already rigging simple hands while we were rigging our arms in the last lesson. But if your character has to do a lot with their hands, hand rigging can get a lot more complicated. So let's refresh our memory on what we already know about rigging very basic hands, and then let's dig a little deeper and look at creating some hands that give us a lot more options in terms of poses. The first thing we looked at, of course, was this very simple jointed rig we made with our farmer woman, and we've rigged the hand as a separate piece that reacts to our hand controller there, rotating and positioning, and we rigged in this simple controller to move the quote-unquote fingers, which is really just this sort of mitten hand here, but it is the fingers. We can imagine this is her fingers grouped together in a bunch. And this simple setup of a simple angle control driving the rotation of this finger piece in the jointed rig can easily be applied to a more complicated rig, but we'll get to that in a minute. So you could argue that this is maybe the simplest of hand rigs, with the only exception being not having the finger control at all. If this did not joint and you just had the hand with no finger bending at all, that would be the simplest possible hand rig, which is basically no hand rigging other than rotating it off of the wrist. But what we're talking about is getting those fingers moving and being able to pose the hand in different ways, at minimum being able to bend those fingers a little bit. We followed the same basic idea with the puppet tool rig that we looked at, and here we're able once again to rotate the hand at the wrist, and then we also added a finger control to bend the fingers as well. And this is all set up exactly the same. We're using null objects that are driving these puppet pins rather than separate layers. But the basic parenting, the IK chain, using the expression pick whip to connect the angle controller is all exactly the same. Now again, this basic idea can be built on pretty simply. For example, here with this farmer man, I've added 3 controllers, one for each of his little fingers there, and so now I can rotate each of those fingers individually, and it would be extremely easy to separate these once again into 1 or 2 more joints, add more rotation controls to control those little joints as well. And I want to keep reminding you that I'm trying to show you as many techniques as I possibly can, but I'm never going to be able to show you every possible combination and permutation. I'm trying to open doors for you by showing you a lot of different approaches, but then it's going to be up to you to mix and match and expand on these ideas. Now let's take a look at a hand rig that builds on this basic idea using jointing and individual angle controls. Now we're going to be looking at this big giant kind of close-up hand here. But I want to stress very clearly that this could just as easily be hanging off the end of a full body rig and rigged in along with everything else, and we're going to look at some examples of that a little later on. But you also may find a need for a close-up hand rig for close-ups that involve complicated finger and hand movement. Because hand rigs can get so complicated, It's sometimes not all that efficient to make a complicated hand rig part of a larger full body rig that may already be fairly complex. And often with full body rigs, you can be a little more subtle with the hand movement, unlike close-ups where you have to have a lot more detail. So these rigs I'm going to show you could work in either world. They could be part of a full body rig or they could be a close-up rig. Just depends on the situation and the needs of the animation. Now this has already been partly rigged. We just need to finish the rig up. Now since you won't have this controller already created for you when you go to do your hand exercise, I'll just quickly kind of recap how that was created. We're just using the same procedure we used to create the hand controllers in the arm lesson. So first off, I set the anchor point where it should be here on the palm or the main part of the hand where that joins with the wrist, where that should rotate off of the wrist. And then I simply just hit the controller button. I'm going to undo that since it's already been done. Just hit that controller button, and then I resized that null up nice and big, in this case 2500 by 3000 pixels to sit around that big giant hand. And then of course you use the anchor point there. You adjust the anchor point to give it a nice position around the hand. So again, it's just exactly the same procedure that we used in the arm lesson. That'll be the first step you go through when you go to rig up your giant hands in the hands exercise. Okay, let's get back to finishing up this rig. So let's take a look at the parts we have to work with here. We're going to be rigging up this index finger. And if we solo first the tip here of the finger, you can see that we've got the outline stopping and the fill just like we did with the arms that had outlines. You'll also notice that we don't have the additional joint at the end of the finger. Human anatomy, there is one more joint right up here. But we're keeping this pretty simple. You could easily include this and have that additional joint. But we're just going to keep this with a two-part finger. And then the other layer, of course, has the outline all the way around. That way we'll get that continuous outline as that rotates. And we're just going to do a really simple jointed FK rig with this. So let's start by setting our anchor points. I'm going to turn some guides on here. And we'll start with the first layer, and then the second. And then we're going to parent these together. So parent finger 2 to finger 1, and then finger 1 to the palm. Now we can go ahead and turn our markers off here. And if we select these rotation values, we can now rotate and pose that finger. Let's take a look at our controller here. So if we select the right-hand controller, you see I made a bunch of angle controls, 2 for each finger. Let's turn everybody back on here. So I've actually already created the controllers for the 2 parts of the index finger here. And so let's go ahead and lock our effect control window. We're going to hold down the Option key and click on the stopwatch for the rotation property. And then grab the pick whip. And grab, we got to make sure we're finger 2. We want to put finger 2 to index 2. And then we're going to do the same thing with the other joint here. Option click on the rotation value, then grab the pick whip, and we're going to go to index 1. Then we can close these up and lock them. And now we can pose that index finger with these controllers, and indeed we can impose the whole hand. The rest of these have already been done. And this is a really basic, simple control, but it's effective. I can pretty much get any pose I want. I have a lot of control here. But it's a little bit clunky. That's a lot of properties that I've got to deal with and manage, and a lot of keyframes that I've got to deal with. And that is always the problem with an FK rig, is that you've got to actually pose each and every part. And remember, that's why we prefer working with IK in many cases. It allows us to pose limbs and extremities using fewer properties and fewer keyframes. So let's quickly clean up this rig and then take a look at how we can use IK to make a slightly more user-friendly version. Before we move on, we should make sure and unlock the effects controls here. This is something I forget to do a lot, but it's so necessary to the rigging process. It's just something you have to get used to try to remember when you lock these to unlock them before you move on. And did you notice there how it jumped to a different composition? I don't know why it does that, but it does that sometimes. But don't freak out if you get a little strange behavior when you are unlocking the effects control window, or forget to unlock it and unlock it after you've done some other things. You'll sometimes get a little odd jumping around of your timeline windows. Alright, this rig is set up just the same way with jointed pieces, 2 for each finger. But the difference here is that rather than an FK rig, we're going to build an IK rig for each of these little fingers. It's going to be a little different than what we've made for our arms, however. So once again, we just have 1 finger left to do here. The rest have already been done, so let's go ahead and take a look at how this goes together. So once again, we've got these 2 layers here. We're going to go through the same steps we went through previously. Alright, now that we've got the anchor points set and we've got them parented together, now we're ready to add a controller. I'm going to just turn everything back on here for a second. Now you'll notice that the controllers are placed at the tips of the fingers. Remember that on our hands, the controller is placed at the wrist, where the wrist rotates. And so we want to think about this as the same as being an arm essentially, but without a hand at the end. So this would be the upper arm and this would be the lower arm. And so the controller, just like in the case of the arm, goes where the wrist position would be, and in the case of this finger, that's the tip of the finger. So let's go ahead and create a controller right there. So I'm going to deselect here and just hit the controller button to just generate a null right in the middle there. And then we'll size it up. And we'll place it in an intuitive spot at the tip of that finger. And then name it. And let's reposition these a little bit. Should probably go index, mid, pinky. And maybe the thumb on top. And then let's build our IK chain. So again, this time we're only going to have 2 layers plus the controller. Now one of the great things about Duik is that it's quite smart and will detect, based on what you select, what kind of IK chain you're looking to create. It'll sometimes give you 1 option, sometimes give you 2 options, but it's pretty good at guessing what you're looking for. So if we select these 2 layers, remember we want to go from the bottom of the chain, which in this case is the tip of the finger, to the top of the chain, which is in this case the first joint of the finger. So we're going to select the bottom to the top, and then the controller, and then we're going to hit IK. Now notice the options it gives us are 1 layer IK with a goal, or 2 layer IK with no goal. That's the one we want. So we're going to hit Create, and then let's see what we got. So when we click and drag on this controller, look at that. Really nice intuitive control over that finger. This kind of 2-layer IK without a goal also works well for things like ears, antenna, simple appendages that just need a little bit of bending and rotating. Okay, let's finish this up. Now we want to parent this controller to the right hand, because when we move the right hand controller, we want those to move with it. Let's lock these and do a little quick cleanup. And let's lock some values here. Now let's pay just a little bit of attention to which properties we're locking and not locking. We have a main hand controller here, which allows us to rotate and position the hand as we need it. And then we have the individual controls over each finger. Oops, we almost forgot to zero out this index finger controller. Once we get that parented to the right hand, we can go ahead and zero that out, so all of our neutral position values are 0. Now the main right hand controller that rotates and positions the hand as a whole, we want to lock all but those 2 properties, which we've done. But these individual finger controllers don't require a rotation value. They only require a position value. So we've already done most of these, but we have to do our index finger. We're going to lock everything except the position. Open up the index controller and lock all those properties. Now we of course don't really have to lock the opacity, but I like to do it just to be neat and also just to very, very quickly direct the animator's eye to the property that they're going to be working with. Now this is a pretty awesome rig right here. It's very intuitive and easy to pose. But you can imagine on a full body rig with a very small hand, these controllers would have to get pretty tiny, and it would be kind of fussy to zoom in and zoom out to manipulate them every time you wanted to pose the hand. This, however, is a terrific rig setup for a hand close-up, but it could be used on a full-body rig as well. All of these techniques, as always, are going to have pros and cons and different trade-offs. Now, both the previous and this hand rig give us a lot of opportunity for individual posing of the fingers, but it does come at the cost of more complicated controls. If you don't need such complicated movement from your hand, we can certainly simplify the controls in a few different ways. Let's take a look at one of those right now. Now here we have a simple jointed FK rig. This technique could be used just as easily with an IK rig or a puppet tool rig. And it allows us to create just some simple opening and closing hand movements that we can access very simply with a slider control. So you can see that I've created a simple little sequence of animation here. The hand is in its neutral position at frame 10. If I slide backward to 0, the hand closes up into a fist, and if I slide forward from 0 to 20, the hand opens up. Now what we're going to do is use Duick's Morpher tool to take all of these keyframes on all these different layers and tie them all to a single slider. It works very much like time remapping, but uses expressions instead of the time remapping effect. And not only is it a really great technique for rigging, it's also a great way to take a complicated piece of animation and boil it down to a single slider that you can animate using the value graph rather than the speed graph. And that was its original intention. But once again, it's also a great tool for rigging. So let's go ahead and set this up. You can find the Morpher tool, again, not in the rigging window, but in the animation window. There it is. And the way it works is it's going to take the keyframes from multiple layers and tie them all to a single slider. You can either select one layer first and it'll place the slider on that layer, or you can just select all your layers and it'll place the slider on the first layer in the sequence. So let's go ahead and hit that Morpher. And there you can see it's added the Morpher slider to this top layer, and it's added 3 keyframes at the 3 values, 0, 10, and 20. Now it looks like nothing's happened, but let's delete the first and last keyframe here. So we just have this neutral position here, 10. Let's slide this back to frame 0, and then watch now when I manipulate this slider value, it now drives all of those keyframes, again, as if it was a time remap. Now that's really cool, because now we're running all that animation off of that one slider. Now you may be asking yourself, why didn't I select the controller first and then all the keyframes and put that Morpher slider right on our controller? That would be really handy. Well, we're going to put a slider on the controller, but I want to put a very specific slider. I like to make sure that on my rigs, to return any property to its neutral position, you just have to zero it out. Now that happens automatically with angle controls, and we can zero out position controls with Duick's Zero script. But with sliders, we have to actually set them up so that our neutral position is 0. The Morpher tool just simply makes the slider based on the first and last keyframes of the sequence of animation. So in this case, it's 0 to 20, with 10 being the middle position. but we want to be able to set the hand at 0 and have it be in its neutral position. So the first thing we're going to do is create a slider that allows us to slide up and down from 0. So with the hand selected, we're going to go and create a slider control, and we're going to name it right, open, close. And if we look at the slider right now, you can see that it defaults to starting at 0 and going up to 100. So it's at 0, that's fine, but we want to be able to go up from 0 and down from 0 into negative numbers. Now let's be clear, this slider is really kind of just a pretty little toy. The value can go below 0 just by clicking and dragging on it. I can get negative numbers. And I can also go higher than 100 by clicking and dragging or typing in numbers there. But the slider control is such a nice intuitive interface, and if we set it up correctly, it's a nicer way to work for the animator. So let's reset the low and high values of this slider. We're going to control-click on its value and choose Edit Value. We want the value at 0. We want the slider range to go from -100 to 100. There now we have a slider that goes down and up from 0. And now we just need to translate 0 to 20 to -100 to 100. So this slider can drive this slider here. And to do that, we're going to use a really cool little piece of expression code. Now I keep a bunch of expression codes in kind of a prefabricated form that I can edit as needed, and I just copy and paste them in. We've provided those to you in the PDF document, Useful Rigging Expressions. So I'm going to go ahead and copy that expression text, and then let's come down here to our slider. Whoops, we should remember to lock our expression control window first. We'll come down to our slider, option click on the stopwatch, and we're going to paste in that expression code. Let's open up our little expression editor by going to the bottom until you see the arrows, clicking and dragging down. And we'll explain how this little code works. The X value where it says pick whip, this is where we will pick whip our slider. A represents the lowest value on the slider. B represents the highest value on the slider. C represents the lowest value on the property you're trying to control. And D represents the highest value on the property you're trying to control. So we want our slider, just as it's already here, from -100 to 100. I leave that in there because it's the one I use the most, but these could be customized to any values you want. Then C and D merely have to be from 0 to 20, because that's the range that we need for this morpher. So I'm going to type 20 in there. And then we need to pick whip the slider itself. So I'm going to select the word pick whip and the greater than and less than symbols on either side. I do not want to select the semicolon. And then I'm going to grab the pick whip and click and drag it and select that slider. Now you can see when I click and drag the slider down, it closes the hand. When I drag it up, it opens the hand. Really nice intuitive control. And again, when we hit 0, it goes right back to neutral. Okay, this is future Morgan from a few hours after I recorded this. I've just realized that I forgot an important step. I forgot to rename the morpher slider after running the morpher script. I was able to get away with it because there was only one morpher in this rig, but it's a bad habit to get into. So always rename your morpher slider, especially if you use more than one in your rig. In fact, you really have to rename that morpher slider if you're using several of them. Now let's go back to the lesson. So this is a much easier way to control the hand than a whole bunch of nulls or a whole bunch of angle controls. It's also, of course, quite a bit more limited. But you could do some variations on this to provide a little more control. For example, you could have this open and close slider only work the 3 fingers, and you could have a separate slider for the thumb. That would give you quite a bit of new posing opportunities just by dividing the thumb control from the finger control. So once again, remember, these techniques I'm showing you can be mixed and matched, and literally countless ways to get simple controls, complicated controls, more options, less options. Really, the sky's the limit. Let's again clean up our rig here before we move on. Now these have all been jointed rigs, but we can of course rig our hand also with the puppet tool. I don't recommend trying to do a puppet tool that includes the hand and all the fingers all on one piece of art with one mesh. Remember that stressing a mesh that way is almost always going to give you trouble. So I really recommend that you joint at least at the knuckles and then use puppet tools to bend the fingers. So let's go ahead and rig up this index finger, and then we're also going to rig up this thumb, but we're going to do something just a little different on the thumb, just so you can see a couple different ways to approach this. So let's go ahead and get started with that index finger. I'm going to unlock that layer, and let's solo it for now, and we'll turn on the marker for that layer as well. And we'll start as always with setting our anchor point. Let's turn off the marker layer, and let's add our puppet pins. So we're going to start with a pin right at that anchor point, of course, and then we're going to put one at the main knuckle right here. We're going to kind of eyeball where that is in the middle. That looks pretty good. That's maybe a little off there. Let me just try, maybe that's a little better. And then we'll put one at the tip of the finger. Now once again, we could put one here and actually separate this last joint, but let's again keep this real simple, and we'll just put one at the tip. Now we're going to go ahead and name our pins. Alright, with our pins named, let's go ahead and add our bones. And let's turn these into orange, since that's our finger color. And we'll parent these up. Fingernail 3 to fingernail 2, fingernail 2 to fingernail 1, fingernail 1 to the palm, the finger 1 artwork to finger 1 null. Now we're going to do once again a 2-layer IK with no goal. Our 2 layers are going to be this second null and this first null. We need this third null and puppet pin to actually move and bend that part of the finger, but it will not be part of our IK chain. Instead, the controller that occupies this same position will be part of our IK chain. So let's go ahead and create that. I'm going to select the finger 1, 3 null, and we're going to hit the controller button. I'm going to resize that, name it, color it purple, and now we're ready to build our IK chain. So once again, we're going to select the finger 1, 2 null, then hold down the command key and select the finger 1, 1 null, and then the controller will hit IK, and again we get the option for 2-layer IK, so we'll hit create, and then we can now bend our finger. Let's parent that controller to the left hand controller and then zero it out. Now we can pose this and add some starch. Alright, let's see how that looks. Good, that looks nice, even getting some good overlapping there. This is a good example of how well the puppet tool works for textured and shaded artwork. Since it actually bends the shading and the texture around the joints, you often get a much more natural look. Alright, now let's go ahead and do the thumb. I'm going to lock these layers here and turn off their visibility temporarily. We can actually turn off all these nulls. We're not going to need those. And then let's unlock the thumb and solo that. Oops. Let's unsolo that controller. Now, as I said, we're going to do the thumb just a little bit differently. With the thumb here, we actually are going to add that additional joint up at the top here, and we're going to use a 2-layer IK with goal in order to control that tip of the thumb in a way that's going to be a little more subtle and give us a few more posing options. So let's go ahead and get our anchor point set, and let's place our puppet pins. One at the layer's anchor point at the base, one at the main joint in the middle. Okay, and here we're going to add one kind of in the middle here. So let's eyeball that about right there, and then right at the tip. Okay, let's go ahead and name these pins. Okay, now that our pins are named, let's go ahead and add our bones. We'll color those blue, and then let's parent those up. So thumb 4 to 3, 3 to 2, 2 to 1, 1 to the palm, and then the thumb artwork to that base thumb 1 null. Now let's create a controller for this thumb. Now again, this time we're going to do a 2-layer IK with a goal, and the goal will be the tip of this finger, or another way to think about it is the tip of this finger will be like the hand on an arm rig. So that means we want our controller's anchor point to occupy this position right here rather than the tip. Let's select thumb null 3 and then hit controller. Okay, with our controller in position and all named, now we can build our IK chain for the thumb. So again, we have a pin and a null here right at the tip so that the artwork can actually bend using the puppet tool, but that won't be actually part of our chain. So we're starting with thumb 3, holding down the command key, 2, 1, and the controller. IK, and this time it's offering us either a 3-layer IK with no goal or a 2-layer IK with a goal, and that's the one we want. So we'll hit create, and now when we move this thumb, you can see that we've got separate control over that thumb tip, and then we're getting bending of the thumb again just like it's an arm on the joints above. Let's undo back here. And let's right away get this parented and zeroed so we can add some starch. It obviously needs some starch. So we're going to parent that thumb to the left hand. Then we're going to zero that value out. And now we can pose it and do a little starching here. So once again, I'm trying to solidify all the areas that would have bones and leave flexible areas where the joints are. So let's see how this looks. Oh, that looks really good and pretty natural too. And I can now rotate that thumb tip, and you can see we're getting a really nice, very subtle range of motion here with this thumb. Okay, let's turn everything on and then clean up here. Oops, we still have some nulls there that we need to turn off. Again, a really nice, intuitive control. And we've got a little extra subtlety on that thumb now, which is really nice. But it's still a lot of controllers, and as we mentioned, with a larger rig, this could be a little bit unwieldy. Let's look at another way we can kind of simplify a similar type of rig. So in this next comp here, we have basically exactly the same rig with one difference. Rather than having the 2-layer IK with a goal on the thumb, we just have a simple 2-layer IK without a goal, just like the fingers, just to simplify that a little bit. But let's look at a couple very simple ways that we can really simplify this hand rig. And it's just working with simple parenting. But anytime we're going to do any mucking around with parenting, we want to unparent them and sort of start fresh, because otherwise we can get into trouble. So let's select those finger and thumb controllers and just select no parent. Because we're going to be changing our values by parenting different things together. To be on the safe side, it's best to just go ahead and delete the 0 nulls. So we're going to unlock those and just get rid of them. And when we're ready to re-zero things out, we can just do it again. It's quick and easy. Now let's go ahead and simplify these controls. Let's create a single null object to control all the fingers. So with nothing selected, I'm just going to hit the controller button to generate a null. And let's resize this and name it. And we'll make it purple, of course. And let's position it just somewhere kind of intuitive here. And then we can simply parent these hand controllers all to that finger null, and then that finger null back to the left hand. We could go ahead and turn off the visibility of all these controllers and shy them away so that we only had these two controls to control the hand. Our main controller to rotate and position the hand, and then this smaller controller which allows us this kind of simple control over the fingers. Now I can't get really complicated or subtle poses, but I can get some really good basic hand movement here with a very simple interface. Now of course I could go ahead now and zero out this finger control and lock the properties and we'd be all set. But let's say you wanted just a little more control. Let's kind of go in between. Get a slightly more posable hand. So let's go ahead and unshy these things again. And what we're going to do is turn on the thumb control again and parent it directly to the left hand. We'll take the shy off, and now we'll hit the shy again, and now we have this control. Now we have a thumb that can be moved individually and the controller for the fingers to move the fingers as a single unit. Now this gives us a lot more options than what we had with just the single control, and it's really not a lot more complicated. I would maybe want to reposition this finger controller to make it a little more intuitive. So let's go ahead and do that just so we can kind of see how this sort of thing works. So again, we want to be careful about our parenting. So let's start by first unparenting these controllers here. And now we can freely move the fingers controller, and maybe we just position it over that middle finger. And this is a little bit crowded and clunky, and I really like to try to make the interface as elegant as possible. So let's maybe try something that communicates that this controls all the fingers. Okay, now let's go ahead and reparent those finger controllers to that group finger controller. Go ahead and shy everything up again. And again, our final step really should be to zero these out. And again, we have a nice, really simple and intuitive control for this hand. And it's really pretty posable. Most of the time, the fingers are going to kind of move in tandem in a lot of hand positions. Now he can't stick out his index finger or his pinky while holding a cup of tea, but that could be rigged in if that was required. And the idea here is, again, there's a lot of different ways to approach this stuff. I could never give you every combination possible, but hopefully this gives you a few good ideas for rigging up mechanical hands. Now let's take a look at these rather than sort of isolated with these big close-up hands. Let's take a look at some of these in action with some full body rigs. Okay, so let's take a look at this orange lady here, and you can see that we've already got one arm fully rigged here. And let's zoom in, and we'll see that we've got a very similar kind of rig for the hand to the one we just looked at, where when I click and drag on this controller, it just moves all the fingers in a fairly natural way. Now we've added a little something here which we could easily add to our other rigs, which is we've got an IK orientation checkbox here. So I can uncheck that and I can reverse the direction the IK bends, which gives the fingers a lot more posing options. Let's go ahead and finish the same rig on the other side so we can just kind of see how this goes together. It's basically the same as what we just looked at, but just so you guys can see how this is all parented in and connected up with the arm and the rest of the body. So we've actually already got some of our work done. We've actually got our basic IK chain already rigged up on this arm, but we need to add the rigging for the fingers. So let's go down to the green layer here, which is our right arm, and let's unlock these layers. And right now you can see we just have the artwork layers just parented to the hand. The hand is parented to the wrist null on that puppet tooled arm, and then that's the base of our IK chain from the wrist, lower arm, upper arm. Oops, and I just noticed I missed a step here. It's good to catch these things when you spy them. I forgot to parent the artwork to the upper arm null. Always want to remember to do that. Parent that artwork into your IK chain. So we're going to go ahead and put puppet tools on these fingers in order to get them to bend. So 2 of them have already been done. Let's go ahead and do this last finger here. I'm going to zoom way in, and obviously this is the smallest thing we've put a puppet tool on so far. So let's solo this little finger and turn our resolution up. You'll also note I've already set the anchor point for this layer. And then let's grab our puppet pin tool. And because this little guy is so small, let's turn our expansion down to 10. And we'll turn our triangles to 750. I usually keep the expansion up a little ways because there's sometimes things exactly like this, little bits of stuff that doesn't always get captured in the mesh correctly, some of which you don't want there, but usually, like in this case, we want this little bit of kind of sketchy artwork in place there. Also, you may want to make a change to the artwork, and if you're really lucky and the change is a small one, that change will stay within the mesh you've created and animated, and you won't have to tear apart and rebuild your puppet tool rig. So a little bit of expansion around the mesh I've just found is a good little safety measure. But again, for something so small, we can definitely turn it down, and we can take the triangles down because we don't need all of that softness and the deformation with something this tiny. So let's go ahead and place our pins, one at the end, one in the middle, one at the tip. We're going to name our pins. Okay, and now that our pins are named, we'll see that we already have our pins named on our other fingers here. So let's select all 3 of these layers, 1, 2, 3, and add our bones. Let's go ahead and color these all green. Let's close these up. Now usually I would wait to starch this finger until we got it all rigged up. But since this is such a simple situation and I've already starched up the other fingers, I'm just going to go ahead and starch this up. I know pretty much exactly what I need, just a relatively clean bend in the middle there. So let's go ahead and select that layer and our starch tool. If you don't see your mesh right away when you select the starch tool, and in different situations it will and won't pop up, simply hit the E key to open effects and then select the puppet effect, and that mesh will pop right up. And then we're going to go ahead and turn this extent way down since this is just a small thing, and we're going to put a blob of starch there in the front and a blob of starch on the back end there, and that should do it. Let's go ahead and parent up these layers. So starting at the top here, finger 1 null 3 to null 2, 2 to null 1, null 1 down to the wrist. The artwork for the finger should be parented to that first finger null, that base null. Then we're just going to repeat the process. Let's turn the rest of these fingers on so we can see them. And the next thing we want to do is create controllers for each finger. We're going to create 2-layer IK chains without goals for each one of the fingers, just like we did for the close-up hand. And so we're going to need a controller at the end of each finger. But remember that these controllers will not be used by the animator. We're going to parent all these to a master controller that'll control all the fingers all at once. Now the way the Do-It controller script works at its default setting is when you make a controller, it pops that controller all the way to the top of your timeline. But we actually want the controllers to stay down here so we can work with them more easily and we don't have to scroll up and down. So we're just going to temporarily change one of Duik's default settings. So I'm going to click on the settings here. We're going to make sure we're on rigging. And you'll see under controllers here, the placement is set for top layer. We're just going to change that to overlayer for now, just while we do this little bit of work here. So I'm going to go back to the rigging window, and let's go ahead and create some controllers. So we're selecting the bottom of each IK chain, the tip of the fingers. Select controller. Oh my goodness, it's huge. That's okay, we'll bring it way down, even smaller than that. And let's add the other two controllers. Now I'm not going to bother to rename these null objects. Duik adds a capital C at the beginning of them to identify them as a controller. And again, because these won't be interacted with by anyone, I don't care if they have a big, long, crazy name. Now you could change that name if you wanted to make them more recognizable here in the timeline. I'm just going to temporarily leave their color on red so they're contrasty for now. I'll color them back to green once we're done. But that's enough for me just to sort of keep a clear eye on where those controllers are. And now we're going to go ahead and rig up those two-layer IK chains. So once again, we're going from the bottom of the chain to the top, and it's only a two-layer chain, so we're starting with that second null, holding down the command key, grabbing that first null, and then the controller, hit IK, two-layer IK. And let's just zoom in to check our work here. There you have it. We have our nice little simple IK. Let's go ahead and repeat the process for the other fingers. Alright, now that we have our individual finger controllers, let's create the main finger controller that the animator will actually interact with to drive these fingers. So let's turn on our main hand controller and select it. And with that null selected, let's click the controller button, just to pop a new null right where we can grab it easily. And then let's size it down. And I'm going to snap this null's anchor point to its bottom corner. And then I'm going to snap that corner down into the corner of my larger null here. Then I'm going to grab the pan behind tool again, and I'm going to snap that anchor point to this upper corner. And we're going to scoot this null in by 20 pixels on the bottom and the side. This gives us a nice clean interface that kind of visually combines the finger control with the hand control. Let's also name this controller, and then let's parent this together. So we want each of our finger controllers, our individual finger controller nulls, to be parented to that right finger null we just created. Then we want that right finger null parented to the right hand controller, and then we want to zero that controller out. Now when we click and drag on that controller, it moves our fingers. Now you can see that our IK orientation isn't all exactly in the right direction. So we can change that easily enough. But we're also going to have to do something else, which is create the ability to switch the IK here on this controller. Remember that when we created each of these IK chains, our IK orientation switch went on each of these null controllers. But these are going to be buried away inside the guts of our rig. We need to get that control to our animator. So let's start by setting the IK orientation the same way for each finger. There, they're now bending all together now. And then let's add an IK orientation checkbox so we can control all of these IK orientations with one checkbox on our finger controller here. So with that selected, I'm going to go up under Effect, Expression Controls, Checkbox Control, and we'll name this IK Orientation. We're going to lock that Effect Control window, and we're going to open the effects controls on these finger controllers. And then we'll use expressions and the pick whip to go ahead and tie these together. So Option click on the first one here, grab the pick whip, and pick whip from this checkbox to this checkbox, the second one, and the third one. And now, if we bend these fingers and then check the checkbox, it reverses the orientation of all three layers all at once. Let's turn the rest of our layers on and clean up the rig a little bit. So again, we want to make sure that all unnecessary layers and null objects are turned off, all the artwork is turned on, and everything is locked and shied except the controllers. So this is a fun, intuitive control for this kind of cartoony, sketchy lady here. We can pick up her arms, we can pose her little fingers, and we can get a lot of different poses now from her little hands. Now again, keep in mind we could have had individual controls for each finger. We might have had a thumb in here. She doesn't happen to have a thumb, but we could have a thumb control if she had a thumb. These could also have been jointed rather than puppet-tooled fingers. Remember that many of these techniques can be mixed and matched for specific situations. And this is a good example of what is essentially a jointed, even though we use puppet tools to bend the fingers, each finger is jointed, and then the wrist is jointed. So we basically have a jointed hand rig overall, despite those little puppet tools there, along with a puppet tooled arm. But even with a 100% puppet tooled arm, that includes the hand and fingers in the mesh. We can still include mechanical hand and finger rigging as part of that setup. Now this trick I'm going to show you also works with the replacement hands we're going to look at later. And it's a trick that has other applications in rigging that can be very useful. So let's take a look. Okay, I've got this orange man's one arm here, and don't worry about his missing hand. We're going to put that back in just a minute, so don't worry, he's fine. But we've got this hand rigged up, and let's take a look really quick. This is a 100% puppet tooled arm all the way down to the hand and fingers, and you can see that in the way that the artwork is bending and flexing there. Oops, and I just realized I forgot to unlock the right fingers from our other rig, so let's unlock that, and notice that jumped us back. Let's jump it back to him here, and now we see the controls for his hand here, and you can see we've got an open and close slider similar to the one we created with the close-up hand. And so if I slide this forward, he closes his hand up. If I slide this backward, he opens his hand up. Now, this guy doesn't have a thumb, so this open and close kind of looks like just curling back and forth. It didn't quite work the way I expected, but you get the idea. He can curl his hand up pretty good there. That's pretty close to close. It's like a fist there that he makes. And this is that same kind of very simple control that we set up using those close-up hands and the morph tool. This is done in exactly the same way. But it is all happening inside this puppet tool. So we've got the puppet tool and we've got this ability to have some mechanical rigging on the hand. So let's go ahead and complete the same rig on the other arm here so you can see how this goes together. But before we dive in, let's make a small correction to this arm. I don't know if you noticed, but when that shoulder starts to rotate a lot, the artwork is now sort of encroaching over on the artwork of the torso, and that's going to be kind of distracting in animation. So let's look at a good, easy way to fix that. It's really just that we've got to take some of this artwork back from the edge of the shoulder. But we don't want to just use a crude mask and lose some of the nice texture at the edge of this artwork. So instead, I'm going to look at the pre-comp that contains this arm artwork. Now here's the right arm pre-comp here. Now in some cases you may not have a pre-comp in place. You may have your rigging in place but not pre-comp. You can always pre-comp something, leave all the attributes in this comp, that way you won't spoil your rigging, and then you can make this kind of adjustment. So I'm going to go ahead and unlock this and double click on it, and there's the arm, and what we got to do is take down a little bit of this shoulder artwork. But notice that we've got yet another pre-comp here that is just the arm without the hand and fingers. I'm going to go ahead and do that inside here. I'm going to go down to the most base layer I can get to. So I'm going to double click on that, and there we go, just the raw layer here with the arm in it. And I'm going to select that orange arm layer, and we're just going to put a mesh warp on this. So I'm going to choose the mesh warp. I'm just going to change it to 1 row and 1 column each. And all we really need to do is just pull this down just a little bit. Just pull that back a little. That's probably going to be enough. Let's save that and go on back and see if that's looking better. Yep, there it is. All right, let me see if that gets covered up anymore. Now it's very important, just a little note here. Notice that my arm artwork layer is selected, and this is a layer that has a puppet tool on it. It's really, really important that if that is not locked and selected, that I do not, with my arrow tool, click and drag on the artwork. Let me just quickly show you what happens. If I click and drag, okay, notice how the layer moved positions, but the artwork stayed in the same place. I'm going to undo that back. That's because the artwork is now being held in place by the puppet tools. And by moving the artwork out of whack like that, I could potentially cause problems with my puppet tool rig. So you want to be very careful of that. It's part of the reason why I lock and unlock things so obsessively. So I want to make sure I select this right-hand controller before I click and drag, and just want to make sure that there's nothing else being covered up. Okay, seeing a little bit of something there, but I think that's just the lower resolution. Yep, that looks clean all the way around. So a nice easy fix there for that little artwork problem, and we didn't have to lose the nice texture of the artwork. All right, let's go ahead and rig up that other arm. Now we've already done some of the work here, so let's lock up that right arm, and we're going to unlock the left arm composition, which you can see is floating in the middle covering his face, and this layer here, which is our left arm guide. This is just a duplicate of the original arm layer before I pre-compose the arm, hand, and fingers all into one layer. I cropped that layer, so let's go ahead and double click on that. As you can see, this composition has been cropped, and so now we have to reposition it inside this comp. So I'm going to turn the guide layer to a difference blend mode, and then we're going to grab this comp and slide it over and line it up. And we've done this before, but just a review here. The cool thing about using the difference blend mode for aligning artwork is that when we get the artwork lined up, the image will simply turn black. So I'm going to get this close. I'm going to turn the resolution up, and then we'll do a little nudging to get this into place. Boom, all black. So just those little nudges back and forth, once we lined up all those little hair shapes there, it just snapped to black. Now we know this is pixel to pixel exactly where it should be. All right, now we can delete that guide, and let's pull back, and we'll solo this arm for now. And let's go into that arm and see what we have set up here. Once again, we've got some of our work already done. We've got null controllers on 2 of these fingers, and we just need to do the same for this little finger here. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to select that finger. Whoa, look at that. If I solo that, holy cow, that's really long. In fact, the end of that finger is way back here. That's not going to rotate very well. It's going to kind of stick the finger out of the side of the arm, and I want those fingers to rotate off the end of the arm. So we got to trim that down a little bit. We got to trim that finger down. Let's actually turn the multiply on here so we can see, yeah, that's overlapping way too much. So let's quickly adjust this. So I'm going to grab that finger, and we're just going to pre-compose it, leaving all the attributes in this comp. And we'll just call it finger 3 underscore comp. Now inside this comp here, let's just mask this off. I don't need such a pretty edge here. This is so tiny. no one's ever going to see this, so I'm just going to grab the pen tool, and I think we want to be, we'll have to double check this, but I think we want to be right about there. Just make sure we have a little rounded end. All right, let's save that and go back and see. Maybe a little too much. Let's pull that back just a little. There we are. Now we have a good overlap to work with. And look, our anchor point's almost already in the right place. Let's go ahead and color that orange again. I'm going to leave these little controllers red for now. And let's go ahead and rig up finger 3. And this is all a repeat, so we're just going to zip right through this. Okay, now that we've got our IK chains on all of our fingers, let's create a simple sequence of animation to quote-unquote open and close the hand. Really just kind of curling the fingers one way and curling the fingers another way with this very, very simple hand. Okay, this is looking pretty good. Now notice that I had to spend a lot of time with these curves and the switching of the IK orientation. So in this curl here, the orientation is one way, and then as the fingers straighten up, the IK orientation switches, and then they can curl the other way, and then we can get this back and forth movement. And you can see we're getting a little bit of snapping and popping on that finger there. I could spend a little more time fussing with that motion path and clear that out, but this is good enough for our purposes here. So we're going to add our morpher and tie this into a slider control in a little bit. But first we have to kind of get ready for the puppet tool rig we're going to build in our main rig comp here. And I'll show you quick why we have to take this extra step. So we want this hand to be able to move and these fingers to bend back and forth. If I was to try to add a puppet tool to this now with the fingers bent, and let's go ahead and just do this for demonstration purposes, and I was going to apply my puppet tool there. Oh, let's turn our expansion and our triangles back up now that we're working with big objects again. Okay, so we've added our puppet tool, and notice how the mesh has grabbed around the shape of those fingers. Well, what happens now if we try to jump forward 10 frames? I'll put another puppet pin here just for, again, for demonstration purposes. So notice now the tips of these fingers are now outside the mesh. And look, oops, when I try to move the mesh, it leaves behind little bits of the fingers like they're cut off because they weren't a part of that original mesh grab. So let's get rid of this, and I'll show you guys how to set this up so you can have that movement in the fingers along with the puppet tool. Anytime you make a mistake with the puppet tool and you need to start over, the easiest thing to do is just to delete the entire puppet effect and completely start from scratch. So I'm going to deselect first and then just select that puppet effect and then hit the delete key to remove that entire effect. Alright, let's go back into the arm comp and we'll look at how we're going to set this up. What we're going to do is create a dummy mask. It'll actually be a shape layer, so let's go ahead and grab our pen tool. And we're going to draw, at first, just kind of a simple oval here around our hand. And then let's drag this down and put this underneath all of our layers. And we're going to call this dummy, because this isn't going to be used for anything other than this simple purpose. So now what I want to do is scrub through my animation, and I want to arrange this dummy shape so all the movement of the fingers stays within the shape. There we go. So throughout the entire range of motion, those fingers stay within that dummy shape. Now let's go back to our Orange Man rig here. We need to quick set our anchor point here for this shoulder. And now we're ready to set our puppet pins. Now note, as soon as I click that puppet pin and we add our mesh, now the mesh is going all the way around this shape, which means that within that mesh, these fingers can now move, but still be driven by the mesh and not have any pieces fall out. Let's real quick set the rest of our pins here. And then before we finish rigging up this arm, we just have to go back into this arm comp and just turn off the visibility of that dummy layer. And now once again we have our puppet tool rig with the ability to move the fingers inside the puppet tool mesh. So let's go ahead and finish rigging up this arm. We'll speed through this part because you've seen this a bunch of times. Okay, we've got our arm rigged up here and we've got some starch on there. Now one thing I want you to notice real quick, let's select that layer and turn the starch on here. Note that we put a healthy amount of starch basically covering the whole hand area. That way our hand won't be distorted by the puppet mesh while it's changing and posing based on the animation we created. So let's finish rigging this up. Let's add our slider control to control our finger animation. So I'm going to select the left hand, go under Effect Controls, and we will choose a slider control, and we'll name this. And let's set the low and high values of the slider range, -100 to 100. And then let's lock our effect control window. Now with that effect control window locked, I can even go to another composition and that stays in place. That will allow us now to connect things to this controller in our main rig comp from this pre-comp. So let's add our morpher. We've got our animation here. Let's select all of the keyframes in our animation and let's click morpher. Now that's added our morpher here on this first null. So let's name the morpher right away. Remember, we want to name the morphers immediately, especially if you have more than one. We'll call this L open close morpher. Now that morpher has its own keyframes on it right there. Let's go ahead and delete all but the middle one. Slide that to frame 0. Now let's go ahead and copy and paste in our little magic code. There's our little code, and we're going to start by pick whipping our slider. And then we change our C and D value from 0 to 0 to 0 to 20. And now our slider will now drive that animation. Let's go ahead and close all this up and lock it. Even though it's inside of a pre-comp, I still like to keep things pretty snug. Now we also want to turn off the visibility of these null objects that are not set to be guides. So we could either just turn off their visibility here, or we could actually turn them into guides, and that might be a nice way to work here, because if we need to come in here and make any adjustments, it would be nice not to have to turn everything on and off. And if we have a layer set as a guide, not only will it never render, but you also won't see it in a main comp if it's pre-comped. So I'm going to go ahead and select these three guys here, turn these into guide layers, lock those back up again, and now when we go back to our Orange Man comp, you don't see those little null objects. We better unlock our effect control before we get into trouble. Okay. And again, there's our nice slider control to open and close our hand. And all we need to do now is finish cleaning up. And there you have it. A really nice combination of puppet tooling and mechanical hand rigging that gives us a lot of really nice options. And we've also seen how we can rig a mechanical hand in with a sort of more regular jointed hand and wrist situation. In the next video, we'll look at rigging hands using the replacement technique. It offers a different range of pros and cons and gives and takes, just like all of our techniques. I think in general, you're probably often going to want to choose replacement hands over mechanical hand rigging, but once again, it always depends on the individual situation.